A homeless law student, struggling to survive, and a wealthy widow, twice his age, strike a deal that could change both their lives. At first, it's all about survival, a marriage of convenience that seems like the perfect solution. But when secrets begin to unravel, what was once a simple arrangement soon becomes a deadly game of trust, betrayal, and unexpected affection. What starts as a contract for stability could end up as something far more dangerous and more profound. You won't believe the shocking twists that await. But before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Daniel Hayes sat hunched over in a dingy corner of a small, nearly empty coffee shop, the half-empty mug of lukewarm coffee growing cold in front of him. His law textbooks were strewn out on the table, but the words blurred before his eyes. The weight of his future, once full of hope and ambition, now felt heavy and suffocating. It was only a year ago that Daniel had been a promising law student, full of optimism and drive, but everything had changed in a matter of months. He had come from humble beginnings, raised in a cramped apartment in a neighborhood that was too often forgotten by those who held the power to change things. Growing up, Daniel had been determined to escape his circumstances. He had worked relentlessly to earn a full scholarship to the prestigious Franklin Law School. His life had been on an upward trajectory until the day he lost that scholarship due to an unexpected administrative error. No other options were available. Without the scholarship, he had no way of paying for tuition or rent, leaving him homeless and adrift in a city that never seemed to slow down. Daniel had fallen into a cycle of uncertainty, drifting from one temporary solution to the next, scraping by just enough to survive but never enough to truly thrive. As the minutes passed, Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by the faint buzz of his phone. He glanced down at the screen. The name displayed was unfamiliar: Vivienne Lancaster. His heart skipped a beat. Vivienne Lancaster was a name that carried weight in the city, a widow known for her philanthropy, her enigmatic nature, and her wealth. He had heard rumors about her, the way she kept to herself, the way she managed to build her business empire from the ground up before tragedy struck. Reluctantly, he answered. "Hello?" he asked, his voice tense with curiosity. "This is Vivienne Lancaster," came the calm voice from the other end. "I'm calling because I've heard about your situation, Daniel. I know you've been struggling, and I think I might have a solution for you." Daniel sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. I don't understand. How do you know about me?" "I'm not calling to discuss that," Vivienne continued smoothly. "What I'm offering you is an opportunity. I'd like to propose an arrangement." She paused, as if giving him a moment to absorb the weight of her words. Daniel was silent, unsure of what to say next. "I want to offer you a place to stay," she said, the offer hanging in the air like a tempting invitation. "I will provide you with financial support for your education in exchange for your companionship. Nothing more. All I ask is that you marry me." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. Marry her? He had barely known the woman, and now she was proposing something so absurdly unexpected that he didn't know whether to laugh or feel insulted. Yet, the thought of a place to live, the promise of financial support to finish his degree, seemed too good to pass up. "I know it sounds strange," Vivienne added, as though reading his mind, "but think about it, Daniel. You will be able to complete your education without worrying about your next meal or where you'll sleep. And in return, I only ask for your company. There are no strings attached beyond that." Daniel swallowed hard. It was an unusual offer, but the desperation in his situation pushed him to listen further. "Why me?" Daniel finally asked, his voice wavering slightly. "Why are you doing this?" Vivienne's response was quick and calculated. "Let's just say I believe you and I could benefit from each other. I'm not looking for anything more than companionship, Daniel. I want to offer you stability and security, something you clearly need. The rest, we can figure out." There was a pause as Vivienne waited for his response. The silence stretched for a moment too long as Daniel wrestled with the weight of the decision. On one hand, it felt wrong. On the other, it felt like the only viable way out of the pit he had fallen into. Finally, he spoke. "All right," Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'll do it." Vivienne's voice softened, though it remained poised and confident. "Good. I'll send someone to pick you up tomorrow. We'll meet in person and go over the details. I think this will be the start of something very beneficial for both of us." With that, the call ended. Daniel sat back in his chair, his thoughts racing. What had he just agreed to? It didn't make sense, but what choice did he have? The promise of a roof over his head, the opportunity to finish his degree. He had to take it, even if the price seemed steep. As Daniel stared out the window, the weight of his decision sank in. He was about to marry a woman he barely knew, a woman who, on the surface, seemed kind and generous. But something about the conversation had felt off, like he was being drawn into a web he didn't yet understand. The next morning, Daniel found himself standing outside a sleek black car, a nervous pit settling in his stomach as he glanced up at the towering gates of Vivienne Lancaster's estate. The mansion was unlike anything he had ever seen. The tall, wrought iron gates were flanked by columns adorned with ivy, and beyond them lay a sprawling estate, surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and delicate flower beds. The house itself stood in stark contrast to the rundown apartments and small houses Daniel was used to. Its pale stone facade gleamed in the early sunlight, and the massive windows reflected the light as though the mansion were alive. A sharp voice from behind him interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Hayes, please follow me." The chauffeur, a well-dressed man in a dark suit, was standing by the door, holding it open. He gave Daniel a polite but distant smile, as if he had performed this task 1,000 times before. As Daniel climbed into the back seat of the car, his mind raced. He still couldn't fully comprehend what had happened. Just the night before, he had been sleeping in a shelter, trying to figure out where he would go next. Now, here he was, on his way to marry a stranger. It felt unreal. The car ride was long, the hum of the engine and the occasional turn of the wheels, the only sound filling the silence between Daniel and the driver. He tried to settle his nerves, but the gravity of the situation kept creeping into his thoughts. What kind of woman was Vivienne Lancaster? Was she truly offering him a chance at a new life? Or was there something more sinister at play? When they finally arrived, the gates opened and the car drove up the long, winding driveway that led to the entrance of the mansion. Daniel's palms were sweaty and his heart raced in his chest. The moment the car came to a stop, the chauffeur was already opening the door for him. Daniel stepped out onto the cobbled driveway, the air cool and crisp. He was immediately struck by the grandeur of the place. The mansion loomed over him, its size almost overwhelming. A large fountain stood in front of the entrance, water cascading from its marble sculptures. 2 stone lions stood guard, flanking the front door, their eyes staring down at him. "Mr. Hayes, if you would," the chauffeur gestured toward the grand entrance. Daniel swallowed and nodded, following the man up the steps. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a different world, a world far removed from his struggles. As the door swung open, the warm air from inside the house enveloped him. The interior was equally magnificent, with polished hardwood floors, towering ceilings, and artwork that Daniel couldn't even begin to name. "Miss Lancaster is expecting you," the chauffeur said, his voice cold and detached. "She's in the sitting room." Daniel nodded mutely, his mind racing. The sense of unease grew with each step he took deeper into the house, but he pushed it aside. He had made a decision, and he had to see it through. He was here now. He had no other choice. As he entered the sitting room, he saw Vivienne for the first time in person. She was sitting by the grand fireplace, a delicate teacup in her hand, her long silver hair flowing down her back like a river of moonlight. She looked every bit the wealthy widow she was known to be, elegant, composed, and slightly distant. There was an air of sadness about her, though, a kind of melancholy that hung around her like an unseen weight. Vivienne's eyes met his as he stepped into the room, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. Her gaze was intense, yet calculating, as if she were measuring him up. She set the teacup down on the nearby table and rose to greet him, her movements graceful and deliberate. "Daniel," she said, her voice calm but tinged with an edge that suggested she was not used to being challenged. "It's good to finally meet you in person." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes flickering over his face as if searching for something. "Please, sit." She gestured toward the plush armchair opposite her. Daniel sat, trying to steady his breath as Vivienne sat down across from him. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was as though they were both waiting for the other to speak first. "I know this may feel like a strange proposition," Vivienne began, breaking the silence at last, "but I believe you and I can help each other. You've been struggling, Daniel, and I can see the potential in you. I want to offer you the means to finish your education, to get back on your feet. And in return, I ask for something that may be harder to give, your companionship. We both have our reasons, but I assure you, this arrangement will be mutually beneficial. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type Jewel if you've made it this far. Only those who get this far will understand. Now, let's get back to the story. Daniel nodded slowly, still processing everything. He had been expecting this conversation, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. The reality of the situation was starting to settle in, and with it, the growing unease that he couldn't fully shake. Vivienne paused for a moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. I'm not asking you for love, Daniel. Not yet. There are many things I've been through, and I don't want to be alone anymore. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing just a touch. You see, I've lost a great deal in my life, but what I've found is that sometimes, when you're at your lowest, you have to take opportunities as they come, no matter how unusual they might seem. Daniel's heart raced. There was something in her tone, something in the way she looked at him, that made him think there was more to this than what she was letting on. But before he could respond, Vivienne spoke again. I understand if you have doubts, she said, her voice cool. But think of it this way. This marriage won't be about us. It will be about what you can accomplish, Daniel. What you can become. All I ask is that you trust me. The following days were a blur for Daniel. He had moved into Vivienne Lancaster's estate, and, despite the luxury that surrounded him, he felt more like a visitor than a resident. The mansion was vast, almost oppressive in its size. Every room felt like an echo of a past that Daniel had yet to understand, filled with stories and secrets that had been buried beneath layers of elegance and wealth. Vivienne had kept to herself mostly, only summoning Daniel when she needed his presence. Their conversations were sparse but cordial, as if they were merely two strangers living under the same roof. It wasn't an unpleasant arrangement, but it was definitely not what Daniel had expected. He thought he would find more comfort in the lavish surroundings, but instead, he felt increasingly isolated. Each day, he roamed the expansive halls of the estate, trying to familiarize himself with his new home. The mansion was an architectural masterpiece, with tall, ornate windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of opulence, fine paintings, exquisite sculptures, and delicate tapestries hanging on the walls. The floors were covered in rich Persian rugs, their intricate patterns adding warmth to the otherwise cold, polished surfaces. But despite the beauty of it all, there was an undeniable emptiness. The mansion was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of the servants' footsteps or Vivienne's soft voice drifting through the halls. The space felt vacant, as if it had been designed for someone who was no longer there. Daniel soon learned that Vivienne lived in a world that was meticulously controlled. There were parts of the house that were off limits to him, rooms that were locked with no explanation. A hidden wing, he was told, where Vivienne kept her personal belongings. She had even gone as far as to ask him not to venture near the old library, saying it was a space meant for her alone. He didn't question her, though something about the secrecy stirred his curiosity. One afternoon, after a rather uneventful breakfast with Vivienne, Daniel wandered into the study, the only room in the mansion where he felt a sense of connection. The large mahogany desk was cluttered with papers, some of which seemed to be older than anything Daniel had seen before. Bookshelves lined the walls, but what caught his attention were the photographs scattered across the desk. He approached the desk, picking up a faded photograph of a young Vivienne, much younger than the woman he had met. She was standing next to a man, her arm draped around his shoulder. The man was strikingly handsome, with dark hair and a charming smile. The photo looked like it was taken years ago, but the sadness in Vivienne's eyes suggested a story behind it. As Daniel examined the photo, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Vivienne standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Did you need something, Daniel? Her voice was smooth, but there was a sharpness in it, an edge that made Daniel pause. I was just. Daniel quickly set the photo down, his fingers brushing against a stack of letters that were hidden beneath it. The envelopes were yellowed with age, the handwriting elegant but faded. Before he could examine them further, Vivienne crossed the room and swept the letters off the desk, quickly hiding them in a drawer. Those are personal, she said, her tone cold and final. Not for your eye. Daniel felt a flicker of discomfort at the way she reacted. He had never been one to pry into other people's affairs, but Vivienne's secrecy only made him more determined to understand her better. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her, something she was hiding. Vivienne, noticing the shift in his demeanor, softened slightly. I apologize if I startled you. I just have certain things I prefer to keep private. We all have our pasts, Daniel, and sometimes those pasts are better left untouched. Daniel didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. There was so much he wanted to ask her, so many things he didn't understand. But instead of pressing her further, he nodded, respecting her space as she had requested. As he left the study, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. There was something unsettling about the way Vivienne had reacted, as if she had been caught off guard, or worse, protecting something she didn't want anyone to see. That night, as Daniel lay in his new, unfamiliar bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't a physical presence, but rather a strange, invisible pressure that seemed to linger in the air. The mansion, despite its beauty, was suffocating. The silence was stifling, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the wall. He turned over in bed, trying to get comfortable, but every little sound, every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the curtains seemed amplified in the stillness. It was as though the house was alive, breathing and shifting around. The strange noises continued throughout the night, subtle at first, but growing in intensity, as if something or someone was moving within the wall. Daniel tried to dismiss the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination running wild. But the more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that there was something hidden within the man, something that Vivienne wasn't telling him. The next few days felt increasingly disorienting for Daniel. Despite the lavishness surrounding him, something about the mansion gnawed at. He had always imagined a place like this would bring comfort and stability, but here, it felt as though the walls were closing in on him. It wasn't just the isolation or the secrecy that Vivienne kept. It was the subtle, creeping sense that there were hidden corners of the estate, both literal and figurative, that he was not meant to uncover. One evening, after dinner, Daniel found himself walking the corridors once again, his thoughts swirling with question. Vivienne had been distant all day, only offering short responses to his attempts at conversation. Her coldness had grown more pronounced recently, and Daniel wondered if she had grown weary of their arrangement. The thought disturbed him, but he had grown accustomed to ignoring his discomfort. It was the price he paid for shelter, after all. As he passed through the grand hallway, a faint sound caught his attention, a soft tapping noise coming from somewhere within the house. At first, Daniel dismissed it as the house settling or a distant sound from the staff, but it seemed to be coming from behind one of the walls. His steps slowed as his curiosity got the better of him. He moved closer to the sound, which seemed to pulse with an almost rhythmic pattern. The hallway was dimly lit by tall candles on the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move and flicker in the corners of his eye. The sound was unmistakable now, a tapping, followed by a soft scrape, like something or someone was deliberately tapping against the wood of the wall. It was faint, but in the quiet of the house, it echoed like a whisper. Daniel pressed his ear against the wall. The sound stopped abruptly. He pulled away, suddenly unsure whether he had imagined it. His heart raced, and his mind was flooded with questions. Could it have been Vivienne? Or was there something, or someone, hidden in the mansion? The idea of hidden passages or forgotten rooms came to mind. He had heard rumors of secret doors in old mansions, designed to conceal things that were never meant to be found. His thoughts were interrupted when a soft voice broke the silence. "Is everything all right, Daniel?" Vivienne stood at the end of the hallway, her posture composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of concern. She had appeared as if out of nowhere, almost as though she had been watching him. Daniel quickly straightened, trying to mask his unease. "I thought I heard something." "It's nothing," he said, trying to sound casual. Vivienne's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, as if she was studying him. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eye. "I know this place can be a little overwhelming at first," she said, "but you'll get used to it." Daniel nodded, though the words did little to ease his discomfort. He had been in the mansion for several days now, and each day he felt more and more like a stranger in someone else's life. Vivienne's strange cryptic responses and her avoidance of personal conversation only deepened his suspicion that there was something hidden in the shadows of the estate. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, the unsettling noise from the wall replayed in his mind. He couldn't ignore it any longer. It had been too deliberate to be a coincidence. Something was definitely off. But what could it be? What was Vivienne hiding? The next morning, Daniel found himself standing at the base of the grand staircase, staring up at the second floor. He had already explored the first floor thoroughly, but there was something about the upstairs that called to him. Perhaps it was the locked doors, the ones Vivienne had specifically told him to stay away from. Or perhaps it was the suspicion that there was more to Vivienne's past than she had let on. His feet carried him up the stairs almost without him thinking. The mansion creaked as he walked, each step heavy with the sense that he was crossing into forbidden territory. When he reached the top, the hallway stretched out before him, its length lined with closed doors, each one behind which he imagined secrets were being kept. At the end of the hall stood a door that was slightly ajar. It was one of the doors Vivienne had warned him about, and yet, there it was, just barely open. It was as though the house itself had invited him to step inside, to uncover whatever it was that was hidden within. The temptation was too strong to resist. Daniel reached for the handle, but before he could turn it, a soft, guttural sound echoed from behind the door. A noise that seemed both human and animal, a low, rasping breath. His heart skipped a beat and his hand froze. Was someone in there? He stood motionless, not sure what to do. The sound stopped, but the air felt thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath. His curiosity, tempered with fear, tugged at him, but he knew he couldn't risk angering Vivienne by going further. Instead, Daniel stepped away, his pulse racing as he turned to leave. But as he walked back down the hallway, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. It was as if something was watching him, its presence so palpable he could almost feel it breathing down his neck. He glanced over his shoulder once more, but the hallway behind him was empty. The unease continued to follow him long after he returned to his room. The mansion had changed from a beautiful home into something darker, something that seemed to be hiding more than just a few secrets. Daniel lay in bed again that night, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. What was behind that door? What was Vivienne hiding from him? And why did it feel like the mansion was alive, watching his every move? Daniel could no longer ignore the growing sense that Vivienne was hiding something big. It had started with the strange noises in the hidden rooms, but it was more than just the house itself. It was the woman behind it, the widow who had appeared so gracious and enigmatic, yet who had left so many unanswered questions hanging in the air. Days passed, and the odd sense of unease persisted, settling deeper within Daniel's mind. He found himself growing increasingly restless, unable to concentrate on his study. He had come to Vivienne's mansion to rebuild his life, to escape the streets and the despair that had followed him after the loss of his scholarship. But now, he felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage. One afternoon, while Vivienne was out on one of her routine philanthropic meetings, Daniel took the opportunity to explore further. The mansion, despite its grandeur, had a sense of coldness to rooms with ornate furniture that looked unused, hallways that were eerily silent, and portraits of Vivienne's late husband all looked out at him with vacant eyes. It was as though time had come to a standstill here, frozen in a long-gone era. He found himself drawn again to Vivienne's study. He had been inside it only once, under her watchful eye, and though it seemed like a place of work, it also felt like a sanctuary, a place where secrets were kept. She had made it clear that he wasn't to venture into her personal spaces, but there was something about her study that tugged at him, something he couldn't quite name. With a quiet resolve, Daniel pushed open the door. The study was just as he remembered, stately, with high bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, framed certificates of charity work, and a large mahogany desk at the center of them. There was an undeniable aura of power in the room, as though Vivienne herself had carefully crafted this space to reflect her control over her empire. Daniel's eyes immediately fell on a wooden box tucked away in the corner of the desk. It was old, worn with age, and sealed with a simple brass latch. Something about it drew him in, almost as though it had been placed there on purpose, waiting for him to find it. He hesitated for a moment, but, driven by an overwhelming need to know the truth, he reached for the box. Inside, he found a collection of old photographs and letters, yellowed with age, but still legible. He sifted through them quickly, each image and note revealing fragments of a story he hadn't been told. The photographs were of a younger Vivienne, smiling and vibrant, standing beside a man Daniel immediately recognized as her late husband, Gregory Lancaster. They appeared happy, confident, their smiles bright in each picture, but there was something in the way they held each other that seemed more like a facade than genuine affection. There was a coldness to their poses that made Daniel feel uneasy. Then there were the letters. They were written in a careful hand, the ink faded but still legible. The first few seemed to speak of a growing business empire, of expansion, and of Vivienne's strategic maneuvers in the world of corporate law. But as he moved through the stack, the tone shifted, becoming darker, filled with hints of desperation and regret. One letter caught his eye in particular. It was addressed to a lawyer and spoke of a massive lawsuit, one that had the power to ruin Vivienne's business. The contents of the letter were chilling. It mentioned a series of legal battles and underhanded tactics used by a rival corporation to undermine Vivienne's empire. The letter's final line was especially telling. "If we lose this case, everything will be gone. They will have us at their mercy, Vivienne. There will be no coming back." Daniel's stomach turned. He had heard rumors of Vivienne's business dealings, whispers about her wealth being built on something less than legitimate. But this was the first time he had seen any concrete evidence of the magnitude of her downfall. Vivienne had built her empire on the backs of ruthless business tactics, and now it seemed like her world had been dismantled by the very forces she had once controlled. He continued to sift through the letters, each one revealing more of the tangled web Vivienne had woven. There were references to betrayal, corruption, and even to threats made against her life. It was clear that her rise to power had come with a heavy price, and it was no surprise that she had retreated into the isolation of this mansion. But what caught Daniel's attention the most was a single phrase, scribbled at the bottom of one letter: "I will make them pay for what they've done." The words echoed in Daniel's mind. It was clear now. Vivienne hadn't just lost her fortune, she had lost something far more important: her trust in people. Her need for revenge had poisoned her relationships and, ultimately, had left her alone with her past mistake. Just then, Daniel heard the sound of the front door creaking open. His heart skipped a beat. Vivienne was back. In a panic, Daniel quickly gathered the photos and letters and shoved them back into the box, sealing it shut just as Vivienne entered the study. She paused when she saw him standing there, his face flushed with the guilt of having invaded her private space. "Daniel," Vivienne's voice was soft, yet sharp, as always. "What are you doing?" Daniel straightened, wiping his hands on his pants, and gave her a nervous smile. I was just looking for a book," he stammered, trying to cover his tracks. "I didn't mean to intrude." Vivienne's eyes narrowed for a moment, as though sizing him up. Then, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if she had already figured out what had happened. "You've found more than you were looking for, haven't you?" Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Vivienne had caught him. But more than that, it seemed she had known he would come. She had been waiting for him to discover the truth. Vivienne's calm demeanor barely wavered as she stepped further into the study, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. There was no anger in her voice, no sign of the confrontation Daniel had expected. Instead, her words were cold, almost resigned, as if she had anticipated this moment for a long time. "Sit down, Daniel," she said, motioning to the armchair across from her. "We need to talk." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, but he obeyed, taking a seat across from her, feeling the weight of the box of secrets still hidden on the desk. Vivienne's presence filled the room, and despite her years, there was a certain magnetic intensity about her. It was as if she commanded the space, forcing everything to bend to her will. "I don't know what you've seen, but I'm sure you've realized by now that there's more to this arrangement than you were told," Vivienne continued, folding her hands in front of her. Her eyes, sharp as knives, never left him. Daniel swallowed hard. He had expected an explanation, but not like this. Vivienne was never one to be transparent, and he had always assumed that her reasons for marrying him were tied to her loneliness or her desire for companionship. But this was something entirely different. "You knew what you were getting into when you agreed to this arrangement, Daniel," she said, her voice smooth yet carrying an edge. "I offered you a place to stay, a chance to finish your studies. All I asked in return was your company. What I didn't tell you was that my motivations were far more complicated than just that." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Vivienne's lips tightened, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was lost in thought, her mind drifting back to some distant past. "I didn't marry you out of some fleeting desire for companionship, Daniel," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. "I married you because of your family." Daniel's brows furrowed in confusion. His family? He was a nobody, just a law student struggling to get by. His family didn't have wealth, power, or any influence in the circles Vivienne once ruled. They had always been modest, their lives defined by hard work and struggle. What could his family possibly have to do with Vivienne? "You see," Vivienne continued, her voice now growing more intense, "your family played a role in the fall of mine. I know you don't understand, but I'm about to make you see the truth." Vivienne leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "My business empire, my wealth, everything I built. It was destroyed by the actions of those who were supposed to help me. Lawyers, investors, and most importantly, one key player in your family. They worked together to destroy my legacy. They were the ones who used the law to manipulate the system, to tear down my company." Daniel's mind was spinning. His family? His father was a lawyer, but he had no idea of any involvement in Vivienne's downfall. The world she was describing seemed like a far cry from the modest life he knew. His heart raced as he tried to piece everything together, but he was still missing the full picture. "I don't expect you to believe me right away," Vivienne said, sensing his confusion. "I know it sounds impossible, but there are things your family has done, Daniel, things that you're not aware of. They've destroyed lives in their pursuit of power, and they've ruined mine. All of this," she gestured around the mansion, "was supposed to be mine. It was supposed to be my legacy, my contribution to the world." Vivienne's tone softened then, her eyes revealing a flash of vulnerability that Daniel had never seen before. "And so, I came to you. You were the only one who could help me fix what they had broken. Your family's name, your blood. It's the leverage I need to regain control." Daniel's heart dropped as he processed her words. It was becoming clear now. Vivienne had married him not out of some desire for companionship or even out of pity. She had seen him as a pawn, a tool she could use to exact revenge on those who had wronged her. Vivienne continued, her voice laced with an odd mixture of bitterness and longing. "I knew that if I married you, someone from the very family that played a role in my downfall, I would have the leverage I needed to strike back. I wanted to hurt them the way they hurt me. I wanted them to see me not as the woman they destroyed, but as the woman who could rise from the ashes and take everything back. I wanted them to realize that I was still in control." Daniel sat there, stunned by the revelations. He had come into this arrangement thinking that Vivienne's motivations were simple, that she had been trying to offer him a way out of his own personal turmoil. But now, he saw the extent to which his own family had been involved in her pain. And yet, despite the darkness of her plan, Daniel felt a strange sympathy for her. Her loneliness, her need for retribution, it all made sense now. She had been a woman betrayed, pushed into a corner by those she trusted. Her decision to marry him had been the result of years of heartbreak, not a whimsical desire for a younger man's company. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What do you want from me, Vivienne?" Vivienne's eyes softened, the walls she had so carefully built around herself momentarily slipping away. "I want you to help me, Daniel, but I don't want to be the villain anymore. I don't want to live this life of revenge and bitterness. I need to find a way to live with what's happened." Her words hit Daniel like a wave. For the first time, he could see her. Not as a woman holding all the cards, but as a broken person who had lost everything. This wasn't about power. This was about a woman who had been wronged and was struggling to find her way out of the darkness. The night air was crisp as Daniel stood at the foot of the grand staircase, staring up at the towering figure of Vivienne Lancaster. The mansion felt emptier tonight, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Daniel could almost hear the beating of his heart echoing in the silence. His mind had been spinning all afternoon, trying to process the truths Vivienne had revealed to him, but now, facing her once again, he was overwhelmed by a sense of urgency and confusion. The discoveries he had made, the strange pieces of a puzzle he had stumbled upon in Vivienne's private study, all seemed to point to one undeniable fact. Vivienne had married him for reasons that went far beyond what he had ever imagined. He had been her pawn, a tool in her calculated game of revenge against his family. And yet, despite everything, there was still something about her that kept pulling him in, something human, fragile, that he couldn't quite dismiss. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Vivienne's footsteps echoing down the hallway. She appeared, as always, poised and composed, her presence commanding the room. But tonight, her usual air of indifference was replaced by something else, something raw. Her eyes, usually guarded, seemed to carry a hint of sorrow. There was a vulnerability to her he had never seen before, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if she was the same woman who had plotted his family's downfall. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice betraying a touch of hesitation. "I know you're angry. I know you feel betrayed. But please, just hear me out. I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe that." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He was struggling to process the whirlwind of emotions crashing through him. The anger he felt toward Vivienne, The betrayal, the sense of being used, was palpable. But beneath that, there was something else. Confusion. The woman standing before him was not the same woman he had initially thought her to be. She was no longer just a villain in his eyes. She was a person. A complicated woman whose past had shaped her into something hard to understand. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore, Vivienne," Daniel finally said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Everything you told me, everything I've discovered about your intentions, none of it feels real. You've been using me this entire time. You knew about my family's involvement in your business's downfall." Vivienne winced at his words, but didn't look away. "Yes, Daniel," she admitted, her tone regretful. "I did, but it wasn't as simple as that. I wasn't just using you. I thought if I could control the situation, if I could make your family pay for what they did to me, maybe I'd find peace. But I was wrong. I see that now." Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't the Vivienne he had come to know over the past few weeks, the woman who had seemed so in control, so untouchable. This was someone different. This was a woman who had been consumed by anger and a need for retribution, but also a woman who was finally beginning to see the cost of her actions. "You're telling me it wasn't just about revenge?" Daniel asked incredulously. "Because it sure as hell felt like it. You used me as a pawn in your game, Vivienne. I'm not stupid. I know what you were doing." Vivienne took a deep breath, steadying herself before she continued. "It was about more than revenge, Daniel. It was about restoring my dignity, my sense of self. After everything that happened to me, losing my company, my reputation, it felt like the only way I could take back some control was through your family. You don't understand what it's like to lose everything. To have the life you built crumble around you, to be forced to watch as people who should have supported you tear you apart." Daniel stared at her, his anger bubbling beneath the surface, but a part of him couldn't help but feel a flicker of empathy. He had known hardship in his own way, though not to the same extent as Vivienne. Still, her words hit close to home. Losing control, losing everything you had worked for, it was something he could understand, even if he hadn't experienced it on the same scale. Let's have some fun with the readers in the comments. Type love if you've made it this far. Now, let's get back to the story. "Maybe I don't understand your pain, Vivienne," Daniel said, his voice low and strained. "But I do understand what it feels like to be desperate, to be pushed to the edge, to do whatever it takes to survive. That's how I ended up here. I wasn't just looking for a place to stay or financial support. I was looking for a way out of my own nightmare. But now I'm stuck in yours." Vivienne's eyes softened, a mixture of sorrow and guilt flashing across her face. She stepped closer, her gaze not leaving his. "I never meant to pull you into my nightmare, Daniel. You were never meant to be a pawn in my game. You were meant to be a companion, someone to help me through my loneliness. I wanted to be seen as more than just the woman who lost everything. I wanted to be seen as someone who could rebuild, someone who still had power, someone who still had worth. But I've come to realize that I can't do this alone. I can't keep fighting this battle without losing myself in the process." The words hung in the air, heavy and fraught with the weight of everything that had come before. Daniel could feel the rawness in her confession, the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of pride and deflection. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. It was as if the ground beneath him had shifted, and he wasn't sure where to stand anymore. "I don't know what to say, Vivienne," Daniel admitted, his voice a whisper. "I don't know if I can just forget everything you've done. I don't know if I can move past the fact that you used me." Vivienne looked at him, her expression vulnerable, her eyes filled with regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't even expect you to forgive me at all. But I hope that, in time, you'll understand that what I did wasn't just about revenge. It was about trying to find something, anything, that would make me feel alive again. And now I'm not sure what to do." Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision before him. He had always prided himself on making logical decisions, on doing what was right. But right now, he didn't know what the right thing was. There was a deep part of him that wanted to walk away from this, to leave the mansion and never look back. But another part of him, the part that had come to know Vivienne in ways no one else had, wondered if there was still a chance for something more. "I don't know, Vivienne," Daniel said softly, "but I'm not ready to walk away just yet." The moonlight filtered softly through the grand windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the mansion. Daniel stood at the edge of the balcony, the cool night air brushing against his face. But it did little to quell the storm raging within him. His mind raced, replaying his conversation with Vivienne, her words, her admissions, and the growing confusion in his chest. He had come here looking for a way out of his own struggles, a lifeline in the form of Vivienne's offer. But now, he found himself entangled in a web of deceit, betrayal, and an uncomfortable truth. Vivienne was not the simple villain he had once imagined. She was a woman scarred by the past, her actions driven by deep-rooted pain and a need for validation that had led her down a dark path. Yet, despite everything, she had shown him glimpses of her humanity, moments of vulnerability that made it impossible to see her purely as a manipulator. Daniel turned away from the balcony, his eyes narrowing as he thought about the situation at hand. What was he supposed to do now? Vivienne had confessed her motives, admitted to using him as a pawn in her scheme for revenge. But she had also shared something deeper, something more complex than just vengeance. Her loneliness, her desire for connection, for being seen as more than just the woman who had lost everything, had driven her actions. It was this mix of motives. The question that weighed most heavily on Daniel's mind, however, was what to do next. Should he expose Vivienne? Should he walk away from her and the promises she had made? He could easily do it. After all, she had used him, manipulated him into this arrangement. But, deep down, he knew he couldn't just turn his back on her, not after everything that had transpired between them. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Emily Thompson, the investigative journalist he had started working with in recent days. Her words were direct and precise. As always, I've gathered more information on your family's involvement in Vivienne's business downfall. We can't let this drag on much longer. The clock's ticking. The message hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily had been instrumental in helping him uncover the truth about Vivienne's past, about the shady dealings and legal manipulations that had led to the destruction of her company. But it also meant that Daniel was caught between two conflicting paths. One where he exposed Vivienne for everything she had done, and one where he tried to protect her from the fallout. Despite the damage she had caused to his family, the dilemma was tearing him apart. On the one hand, Vivienne's actions had consequences. His family had been involved in some of the legal maneuvers that had led to her business's collapse. She had every right to seek revenge, but at the same time, Vivienne's guilt, her growing regret, and her vulnerability were real. She was no longer the cold, calculating woman he had once seen her as. She was a person. Flawed, yes, but human. Daniel sank into a chair by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames doing little to ease the chill in his bones. His thoughts drifted back to his family, his mother, his father, his sister. They had always been the ones he fought for, the ones he had to protect. They had been his everything when he was alone, struggling to survive on the streets. But Vivienne had become a part of that fight too, albeit in a different way. Could he really expose her? Could he really tear down everything she had left, even if it meant protecting his family's name and clearing their reputation? Was that the right thing to do? As the fire crackled softly, Daniel found himself thinking about the conversations he had had with Vivienne, the quiet moments shared in the mansion's drawing room, the hesitant glances, the slowly unfolding understanding. Her motives were no longer as clear-cut as they had seemed. He could see her desire for redemption, for something more than the bitterness she had been living with for so long. But was that enough to change his course? Was it enough to forgive the past and move forward with? Or should he do the right thing, the thing he had always done? Expose the truth, regardless of the personal cost. The conflict in his mind intensified. He couldn't ignore what she had done to him, to his family, but at the same time, he couldn't dismiss the growing connection between them. His heart, so used to being guarded, now found itself torn between the pain of betrayal and the fragile hope of something better. Could he really walk away from the possibility of redemption, not just for Vivienne, but for himself as well? A soft knock at the door broke through his thoughts. It was Vivienne. Daniel? Her voice, though soft, carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. "May I come in?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He knew that what came next would change everything. He had made his decision, but he still had to confront the consequences. The truth, no matter how complicated, had to be revealed. "Come in," Daniel called softly, steeling himself for the conversation that would determine the fate of everything: his relationship with Vivienne, his family's future, and the man he was becoming. As Vivienne stepped into the room, her eyes met his, searching for something. Perhaps forgiveness, perhaps understanding, perhaps a way out of the dark hole she had dug herself in. And in that moment, Daniel realized that the real dilemma wasn't whether to expose her. The real dilemma was whether he could still believe in the possibility of redemption, not just for Vivienne, but for them both. The tension in the mansion had escalated in ways Daniel could not have anticipated. As he prepared for what would surely be the most important conversation of his life, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something more sinister was unfolding around. Vivienne had been forthright about her past, her motives, and the guilt she carried. But as time passed, Daniel's suspicions grew. It was not just her troubled history that troubled him anymore, it was the present. Something was happening behind the scenes. Vivienne had never been fully forthcoming about everything. She had spoken of threats from her past, but was that truly all there was to it? What if her enemies were not just ghosts from history? What if there were those who still lingered in the shadows, determined to finish what had been started years ago? In the weeks following their tense conversation, strange things began to happen with increasing frequency. At night, Daniel would hear strange noises echoing through the walls of Vivienne's grand estate. Unexplained whispers, the sound of something dragging across the floor. Nothing overtly alarming, but enough to make him doubt his own sanity. His first instinct was to dismiss them as figments of his imagination, the byproduct of stress and uncertainty. But soon, the occurrences began to feel too deliberate, too frequent to ignore. One evening, as he wandered through the halls, seeking some distraction from the weight of his thoughts, he noticed a shadow flicker across the wall just ahead of him. The hallway was empty. He had checked it minutes earlier. His heart raced as he moved cautiously forward, unsure of what he would find. The mansion, once a place of refuge, now felt like a maze of hidden dangers and secrets he was only beginning to unravel. He turned the corner into one of the study rooms, where he had often found solace in books and quiet contemplation. As he entered, he saw that something was out of place. A book was missing from the shelf. It had been there that morning, and now it was gone. He stepped closer to the shelf, his eyes scanning the other books. Something didn't feel right. The space behind the missing book looked different, like the faint outline of something hidden there. With trembling hands, he pulled at the edge of the shelf, revealing a hidden compartment. Small, but enough to hide something significant. Inside, there were several old letters, their edges yellowed with age. Most were addressed to Vivienne, but the sender's name was one Daniel didn't recognize. His breath caught in his throat as he read the opening line of one of the letters. "Your betrayal will not go unpunished. You will pay for what you have taken." The words sent a chill down his spine. The message was unmistakable. Vivienne's past was coming for her, but who had left this threat? And why now? Was someone watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike? Was it truly just about her business dealings, or was there more to this story than she had let on? Daniel's heart pounded as he tucked the letters back into the compartment, closing the shelf with a quiet click. The urgency in his veins surged. He needed answers, answers that only Vivienne could provide. But something told him that even she might not be prepared for what was coming. The walls of this mansion, which had once felt like a safe haven, now seemed to pulse with a foreboding energy. He made his way back to Vivienne's private study, where he found her sitting at her desk, scribbling something on a piece of paper. She looked up as he entered, her face expressionless, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "I need to know everything, Vivienne," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "There's something happening here. Something more than just your past coming back to haunt you. It's not over, is it?" Vivienne's face paled as Daniel placed the letter on the desk in front of her. She stared at it for a long moment, her hands trembling. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, Daniel saw genuine fear in her eye. "It's not just the business," Vivienne said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's more. There are people who still want to see me ruined. People who are far more dangerous than I ever let on." Daniel's pulse quickened. Who are they?" Vivienne hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the window as if the shadows themselves might be listening. She stood abruptly, walking to a locked drawer in the corner of the room. With a key she had kept hidden from Daniel, she unlocked it and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside, there were photographs, dozens of them, each one more disturbing than the last. There were images of Vivienne, taken in secret, at various locations. Some were from her past, others more recent. "These are from my past," Vivienne explained, her voice filled with regret. "They are people who were once close to me, but after everything fell apart, they turned on me, Some of them, I think, still want revenge. I never knew how far their reach went until it was too late. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a story of business rivalry. It was a matter of survival. The stakes had just been raised, and they were no longer just about exposing the truth. Someone wanted Vivienne to pay permanently. The question now wasn't whether to confront Vivienne about her past. This wasn't about loyalty to his family or exposing a wrong. This was about keeping both Vivienne and himself alive long enough to uncover the full truth. The weight of Vivienne's past and the threats that had lingered for so long now rested squarely on Daniel's shoulders. The truth, which had once seemed like an abstract concept he could choose to ignore, had become a painful reality. With every new piece of the puzzle, the stakes grew higher. His growing affection for Vivienne, who had transformed from an enigmatic, wealthy widow into a woman burdened by her mistakes and regrets, made him more determined to see justice done. But there was more at play than just her redemption. It was his own future, his own ability to find stability, that was now irrevocably tied to her fate. Vivienne had lived with the weight of her past for so long. Now, it was Daniel's turn to carry that burden, if only for a little while longer. He could no longer afford to simply sit back and let the pieces of the past fall into place. Time was running out, and he could feel the eyes of her enemies closing in. There was no longer any room for hesitation. A plan had begun to take shape in his mind. Daniel knew that Vivienne's enemies were not just remnants of a business rival. The people who had sought to destroy her years ago still had unfinished business, and now they were hunting her down with renewed vigor. The photos, the letters, those were just the beginning. If he was going to help her, he needed more. He needed answers that only one person could give him: Emily Thompson. Emily had been a fixture in Daniel's life for years. As the daughter of a close family friend, she had always been someone he could turn to, whether it was for guidance or support. But now, her skills as an investigative journalist would be his most valuable asset. Emily had spent years uncovering hidden truths, exposing corruption, and bringing justice to the most complex cases. In short, Emily was someone who could dig into the murky waters of Vivienne's past and find the pieces that could finally make sense of the chaos. It was late when Daniel finally reached out to Emily. He had waited for this moment for weeks, hoping that he could find the right words to explain the gravity of the situation. As much as he trusted Emily, he also knew how dangerous this would be. Vivienne's enemies had powerful resources, people with money, influence, and a ruthless desire for revenge. The last thing Daniel wanted was to drag Emily into a conflict that could cost her everything. But in the end, there was no other choice. Daniel needed answers, and he needed them now. With his future and Vivienne's on the line, he dialed Emily's. "Daniel?" Emily answered after a few rings. Her voice was tired, but there was a sharpness to it that Daniel recognized. "What's going on?" "I need your help," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "I need you to dig into Vivienne's past. I've uncovered some things that go deeper than I could have imagined. But I need someone with your skills to help me make sense of it all. We need to find out who is behind these threats before it's too late." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Threats?" Emily asked, her voice hardening. "What are you talking about?" "I'll explain everything when you get here," Daniel replied. "But I need you to come as soon as possible. I can't do this alone." There was another brief pause, and then Emily spoke again. "I'll be there tomorrow. I'll bring everything I need to start looking into this. You're not in this alone, Daniel. Whatever this is, we'll get to the bottom of it." Daniel hung up the phone with a sense of grim determination. Emily was on her way. This was the turning point, where the wheels of their plan would begin to turn in earnest. But as he looked out the window of Vivienne's study, a heavy sense of dread settled over him. This was no longer about uncovering the truth. This was about survival. Vivienne had made it clear that she could never truly escape the consequences of her past. But together, they could at least try to ensure that she didn't have to face it alone. The next day, Emily arrived with a suitcase full of equipment, her mind already working as she processed what Daniel had told her over the phone. They sat together at Vivienne's massive oak desk, the weight of their task hanging over them like a storm cloud. Daniel laid out everything he had discovered so far. The letters, the photographs, the messages left behind in Vivienne's. Emily listened intently, her eyes flicking over the documents with the practiced focus of a seasoned journalist. Every detail mattered. Every clue had the potential to be the key to unlocking the truth. "This isn't just a corporate feud," Emily said, tapping a photo of Vivienne with her late husband. "This is personal. Whoever is doing this to Vivienne is playing a much bigger game. We need to figure out who has the most to lose from her being free of these old ties. Daniel nodded. That's what I'm afraid of. And I think it's more than just business. This goes back to her marriage, to her relationship with her late husband. We need to find out what really happened. Emily leaned back in her chair, processing everything. Her mind was already racing, sorting through the possibility. I'll get started right away, but you're right. This goes deeper than we thought. We need to be careful. Whoever is behind these threats is someone with a lot of power. Daniel took a deep breath. Let's just hope we're not too late. As Emily began her research, Daniel's role became clearer. He would work with her to uncover the truth. Together, they would expose the forces behind Vivienne's torment and ensure that she had a chance at redemption. But as the day wore on, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something even darker than they could have anticipated. The hours ticked by slowly as Daniel and Emily worked in tandem, their shared goal becoming the only focus of their days. The atmosphere in Vivienne's estate was heavy, laden with the tension of their ongoing investigation. With each new discovery, they uncovered not just facts, but pieces of Vivienne's past that painted a picture far more complex than Daniel had ever imagined. Daniel could hardly bear to confront the full scope of what he was learning. Vivienne had lived a life filled with secrets. Secrets that now stood between her and the possibility of a future without fear. The more Daniel uncovered, the more he realized that what Vivienne had done in her youth wasn't just about vengeance or a desire for control. It was about survival. The bitterness, the resentment she had toward her late husband's betrayal and the fall of her business empire, it was all-consuming. But what Daniel hadn't understood at first was that it was not just her desire for revenge that had led her to him. It was the loneliness that had grown over the years. Her heart had been broken, and instead of confronting it, she had buried it in wealth, power, and control. Now, with the walls closing in, it was time for her to face the truth, and so was Daniel. He had to decide where his loyalties lay, with his own moral compass, or with the woman who had, in some strange way, become a surrogate mother to him. This was no longer about financial compensation or even companionship. It was about his own understanding of right and wrong. The day Daniel had feared had finally arrived. The plan was set. They had gathered all the evidence, piecing together Vivienne's history, her business dealings, her marriage, and the trail of destruction she had left in her wake. It was now time to reveal it all to the public. The truth would be set free, no matter the consequences. The press conference was held in the grand ballroom of Vivienne's mansion. The chandeliers gleamed in the midday sunlight, casting a soft glow over the room. Journalists from various media outlets gathered, waiting for the revelations that were about to unfold. But the tension was palpable, and Daniel could feel the weight of his decision pressing against his chest. This would change everything for Vivienne, for him, and for the legacy she had built. There was no turning back now. Vivienne entered the room last, her presence as commanding as ever, though there was an underlying nervousness to her posture. Her usual self-assuredness had been replaced by a vulnerability Daniel had never seen before. She met Daniel's eyes with a silent plea for reassurance, but there was no time for comforting words. The time for truth had come. As the reporters settled, Daniel stood at the podium beside Emily. His heart raced in his chest, but he forced himself to maintain composure. He had to do this, not just for Vivienne, but for himself as well. He had spent so many years searching for answers to questions that had been haunting him since his arrival at Vivienne's estate. Now, he would finally find peace. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us, Daniel began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. Today, we are here to reveal the truth behind Vivienne Lancaster's past and the threats that have plagued her for so long. Vivienne's eyes locked with his as he spoke. She had no more defenses. The walls she had built around herself were crumbling, and Daniel was standing beside her, unwavering, despite the enormity of the moment. We have gathered evidence that links Vivienne Lancaster's past to a series of highly controversial business dealings, ones that were orchestrated by her late husband. But this is not the full story. What I'm about to reveal is not just about business, but about betrayal, manipulation, and the impact these events had on the people involved, especially Vivienne. Daniel continued, his voice growing more intense as he spoke. Vivienne's wealth, was built on a business empire that collapsed due to the actions of powerful people who manipulated the legal system and led to the ruin of her company. Those same people have been orchestrating threats against her for years, seeking to control what's left of her legacy. We have the evidence to prove. A collective murmur rippled through the room as the journalists processed his words. The tension was thick. Vivienne's past was no longer a whispered secret. It was now a public record. Daniel's eyes never left Vivienne. Vivienne didn't just marry me for companionship. There were other motives at play, ones that have now become clear. She was trying to gain leverage over the people responsible for her downfall. But in doing so, she also found something else, a chance for redemption. And that's why I stand here today, not just to reveal the truth, but to help Vivienne clear her name and move forward. The room was silent, the weight of Daniel's words hanging in the air. Vivienne's past was finally laid bare. The people who had wronged her were now in the public spotlight, their actions exposed for the world to see. As the press conference concluded, the police arrived with warrants for the arrest of several of Vivienne's former business rivals, people who had been orchestrating the threats against her and attempting to ruin her reputation. They were taken into custody, their long-running schemes finally coming to an end. But Vivienne, for all her power and wealth, stood beside Daniel, looking at the wreckage of her former life. There was no triumph in her expression, no smug satisfaction. Instead, there was a deep sense of relief. For the first time in years, Vivienne was free. Not from her enemies, but from the self-imposed prison she had lived. She had sought revenge, but what she had found was a chance for something far more profound, the possibility of redemption. Daniel stood by her side, the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. He had done what was right, and in doing so, he had found a new sense of purpose. He no longer saw Vivienne as a means to an end, but as a woman who had suffered, just as he had, and who now stood at the precipice of a new beginning. "Thank you," Vivienne whispered, her voice trembling as she met his gaze, "for everything." And with that, Daniel knew that the long road ahead would be different. They both had a future now, one built on truth, redemption, and the unwavering bond that had been forged in the fire of their shared trial. In the aftermath of Vivienne's public reckoning, the mansion seemed quieter than ever. The once bustling halls, filled with the sounds of staff moving briskly to keep up with Vivienne's demands, now stood still. The only noise was the occasional creak of the old floorboards and the faint hum of distant traffic on the long, winding road that led to the estate. Vivienne had always thought that wealth, power, and influence could shield her from the world's troubles. But now, after everything had been exposed, she realized just how fragile it all truly was. What had she worked so hard for? What had she sacrificed in the name of business and revenge? All those years spent building an empire, securing her future, and plotting her vengeance had been in vain. She had hoped to find peace in the ruins of her past, but peace never came. For the first time in years, Vivienne was left with nothing to hide behind. The carefully crafted walls of her empire had crumbled, and the only thing that remained was a stark and undeniable truth. She had to rebuild, but she would not rebuild her empire or her legacy of wealth. She had something else in mind, something far more important. Daniel, having watched the transformation in Vivienne, felt the weight of his own responsibility. The estate that had once been a symbol of her riches now stood as a testament to her solitude and pain. It was a place that, despite its opulence, had never felt like home. But it had potential for something new, and Daniel knew what needed to be done. He stood on the balcony of the mansion's second-floor library, looking out over the sprawling garden. The morning sun bathed the land in a warm golden hue, a reminder of the new beginning that was just beginning to take root. The weight of Vivienne's debts had always hung heavy over her, but it was no longer about the money, it was about restoring her humanity. The business empire she had once built had been riddled with corruption, manipulations, and secrets, but now it was all in the past. Daniel had helped clear Vivienne's name, but that wasn't enough. She needed to make amends, to find a way to leave behind something positive in the wake of her downfall. She needed to give back. When Daniel had first entered Vivienne's life, he had been a young law student with nothing but the clothes on his back. He had been homeless, his dreams crushed under the weight of circumstance. But Vivienne had offered him a lifeline, a deal that, at the time, seemed too good to be true. She had promised him stability, financial support, and the chance to complete his education. But in return, she had asked for his companionship, a marriage of convenience. Now, Daniel understood that he had been more than just a pawn in Vivienne's game. He had been a catalyst for change. In giving him the opportunity to complete his education, Vivienne had unwittingly provided him with the tools to make a real difference in the world. And that's exactly what he was going to do. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type dog if you've made it this far. Only those who made it will understand. It wasn't just about undoing the damage Vivienne had caused to her own life. It was about giving back to the world that had turned its back on both of them. It was about turning this mansion, this estate, into something far more meaningful than it had ever been. The philanthropic work that Vivienne had once been passionate about could now be the foundation for a new future, and Daniel would be the one to carry it forward. Vivienne entered the room just as Daniel was deep in thought, her footsteps light but steady. She had always carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity, but now there was something different about her, a new sense of resolve. "I've been thinking," Vivienne began, her voice soft but certain. "I've spent so much of my life running from my mistakes, but maybe it's time I stopped. Time to do something that truly matters." Daniel turned toward her, his gaze filled with understanding. He had seen the change in Vivienne over the past few weeks, how she had softened, how she had finally come to terms with the past. She was no longer the same woman who had been driven by revenge and power. "I think I know what we need to do," Daniel said, his voice firm with conviction. "It's time to put this place to good use. We can't undo the past, but we can create something positive moving forward." Vivienne nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the vast grounds outside. She was no longer concerned with maintaining appearances, with hiding behind walls of wealth and isolation. She had come to realize that true peace wouldn't come from the world's validation, but from the people she could help. And that was exactly what she intended to do. Together, they began the process of reimagining Vivienne's estate. The sprawling mansion would no longer be a symbol of loneliness and bitterness. Instead, it would become a center for education and opportunity. The grand gardens would host retreats for underprivileged students, offering them a place to study, relax, and grow. The estate's various rooms would be transformed into classrooms and communal spaces, fostering an environment where students could learn not only about academics, but about life itself. Vivienne's wealth, what was left of it, would be used to fund scholarships for those who, like Daniel, had struggled to find a way out of difficult circumstances. Her story, once defined by scandal and resentment, would now be one of redemption and hope. As the first few weeks passed, Daniel and Vivienne worked tirelessly to bring this vision to life. It wasn't easy, but they were determined. They would take what had once been a house of secrets and turn it into a beacon of hope for the future. Vivienne knew that it wasn't just about giving money, it was about giving the next generation the tools to change their own lives, and it was about leaving behind a legacy that truly mattered. The mansion began to take on a new energy. The rooms once filled with echoes of solitude were now alive with conversation and laughter. Students came and went, their lives forever changed by the generosity that had come from a place of deep regret. And Vivienne, for the first time in a long time, could finally breathe. She had no idea where the road ahead would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. It was no longer about vengeance. It was about helping others and finding peace in the process. The sun set gently over Vivienne Lancaster's estate, casting a warm golden glow across the newly transformed mansion. It was now a place brimming with life, not with the echoes of greed and loneliness that had once reverberated off its marble walls, but with the sounds of young voices filled with hope and ambition. Daniel stood by the garden, watching the students, now like family, chatting amongst themselves, their eyes filled with gratitude and excitement for their futures. For the first time in years, Vivienne's mansion felt like a home, a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to turn. Daniel had made it his mission to ensure that this place was not just a legacy of Vivienne's wealth, but a testament to redemption and the power of second chances. Through his efforts and Vivienne's willingness to change, the estate had become a hub for education, a place where students from underprivileged backgrounds could find refuge, support, and the tools to build their own futures. This wasn't just a scholarship program, it was a movement, a lifeline, and it all began because of the unlikely bond between a homeless student and a lonely millionaire widow. Vivienne had never expected this. She had always seen herself as a woman of control, someone who shaped her destiny through power and influence. But it was the raw truth of her past, the exposure of her deepest fears and regrets, that had sparked something within her, a realization that redemption could not be found in the pursuit of wealth or vengeance, but in the act of helping others. The lessons she had learned, the hard and painful ones, had finally found their place in the world. But what was truly remarkable was how Vivienne had come to view herself through the lens of compassion rather than power. The constant battle within her had softened. No longer was she the cold, calculated businesswoman who saw every situation as a strategic move. Instead, she had transformed into someone who listened, cared, and understood that the worth of a life wasn't determined by how much money you had or how many enemies you could outsmart. It was about the lives you touched along the way. One of the students, a young woman named Lara, approached Daniel with a notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She was the first recipient of Vivienne's new scholarship fund and had become one of Daniel's closest allies in the program. "Daniel," Lara said softly, her voice filled with admiration, "I don't think I could ever thank you enough. You've changed my life." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "No, Lara, you've changed your life. I'm just here to help guide you." As she walked away, Daniel's thoughts turned to the future. He had always been driven by the need to prove himself, but he realized now that his purpose wasn't just about personal success. His success now lay in the success of others. His journey had come full circle, from a homeless law student to the man overseeing a thriving, life-changing educational program. He had found his true calling, not in a courtroom, not in the halls of academia, but in the lives of those he helped to lift up. Vivienne, now sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, watched him with a smile. She had come a long way from the woman who had once been consumed by bitterness and revenge. She had once feared being alone, but now she found peace in her new role, one of purpose, love, and redemption. The mansion had transformed not just in its physical structure, but in the way it felt. The rooms that once held the cold echo of secrets now held warmth, laughter, and the promise of a brighter future for the students who would pass through its doors. As the final students filtered out of the mansion for the evening, Vivienne and Daniel stood side by side, looking over the estate that had become a symbol of second chance. They had faced darkness together, but through it, they had emerged stronger, with a shared sense of purpose. Together, they had forged something beautiful, something that would continue to grow long after their time. "I never thought I'd see the day when this place would feel so full of life," Vivienne said, her voice soft but content. Daniel looked over at her, a glint of gratitude in his eyes. "It's never too late to make things right." Vivienne smiled, her heart lighter than it had ever been. "No, it's never too late." And just like that, the mansion, once a symbol of wealth and isolation, had become a beacon of hope, a place where forgiveness, purpose, and redemption could flourish. What started as a marriage of convenience between two strangers had turned into a bond that neither of them could have predicted. They had discovered that life had a way of leading them where they needed to be, even if it wasn't the path they had envisioned. As the camera pulled back, the mansion stood tall against the night sky, its lights glowing warmly in the distance, a symbol of all that had been healed and rebuilt. Daniel had found his stability, his purpose, and his legacy, while Vivienne had found peace and redemption. And together, they had made a lasting impact on the world, proving that no matter how broken you are, you can always rebuild, one life at a time. So, what do you think? Was Daniel's decision to stay by Vivienne's side the right one? Did he choose redemption over revenge? Or was he just trapped in her web of secrets? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And on a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss any of our heartwarming and dramatic tales. If you're craving more incredible stories, click here on the end screen to keep watching.